Welcome to Just One Question. Here we ask questions that sound very simple but are hard to answer to the best experts we can find anywhere in the world. Today's question is, does the world need borders?
Just One Question, a podcast by Die ZEIT. Just One Question, or nur eine Frage as we call it, is available as a video podcast, an audio podcast, and a written interview. For more on this and our newsletter, visit zeit.de/N1F.
We are recording this on Monday, August the 3rd, just 3 days after some 60,000 people crossed from Morocco into the tiny Spanish enclave of Ceuta in a single day, the largest such surge on record, leaving dozens dead and Europe once again asking what its borders are really for. So does the world need borders? My guest today may be one of the few people on Earth who can answer our question not just as a philosopher, but as a living example of it. So Kwame Anthony Appiah was born in London, raised in Kumasi, Ghana, educated at Cambridge, and today teaches philosophy and law at New York University. The son of a Ghanaian father and a British mother, he has spent his whole life crossing the very borders we want to talk about between nations, cultures, and identities. Few thinkers in the world have reflected more deeply on what we owe each other across those borders. His book, Cosmopolitanism, gave a name to an entire way of seeing the world, and the lies that bind has reshaped how we think about identity, race, and nation. His honors are about as high as they get. National Humanities Medal handed to him by Mr. Obama, the highest honor of the United States given in humanities. He has led the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and for the past decade, he has answered the moral questions of everyday life as the Ethicist for the New York Times Magazine. He's a philosopher, a novelist, and one of the most generous minds of our time. So welcome. And
I'm very glad to be with you.
I have just one question. Does the world need borders?
Yes, just one answer.
Thank you.
I mean,
why is that?
If we need distinct states, distinct nations, then they have to have borders. It doesn't mean they have to be hard to cross, but they have to have borders because they have to be able to regulate who's in and who's out. Because by definition, a state or a nation is a community with a defined membership, and that community gets to decide within constraints set by morality who's in and who's out. So the prior question, the question in the tradition of Kant, who asks what the preconditions are for giving an answer to a question, the prior question is, do we need nations? Do we need distinct states? Shouldn't we just have one global superstate? If we had one global superstate, then we wouldn't need, we might need some constraints on movement, just for practical reasons, but we wouldn't need the kind of constraints that are set by borders.
I learned that you're not a huge fan of superstates.
I'm not a huge fan of many of the actual states today, but I'm certainly not a fan of the idea of creating a kind of global Berlin or a global Washington.
Why not?
Well, look at what the actual Berlin and Washington and Beijing are doing. It's just a general feature of modern states that unless you make enormous efforts, the center, the federal center, accumulates more and more power, and in particular, the executive tends to accumulate power over against the legislative branch of the government. And we're seeing that right now in Washington, where Mr. Trump is claiming powers that no former president has claimed. Sometimes the Supreme Court has told him he doesn't have those powers. But the tendency to do so is not a feature of Mr. Trump, it's a feature of presidents. The tendency, that is, to try to claim to do things. President Biden canceled a bunch of student debt in a way that was, I think, not permitted, and eventually the court said wasn't permitted, because he couldn't persuade the legislature to change the law, and he tried to do it by just executive action. So we've seen a huge increase in the power of the executive almost everywhere. It's true in Britain as well. The Prime Minister has, despite the fact that the Prime Minister has to respond to Parliament, it has to have a majority in Parliament, the claims of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet have increased, I think, over the last 100 years. And my grandfather was in a British cabinet in the mid 1940s. They had way less power than the current executive branch does today. So the founders of the American Constitution recognized that it wasn't a point about the goodness or badness of the occupants of the office of the presidency. It was just that if you had that kind of power, it was going to be tempting to use, overuse, and eventually abuse it. And so they thought about how you could place constraints on that executive power. And one was to require that the president couldn't spend any money without a law allowing him to spend that money. So the legislature decides how the government spends money, and that obviously heavily constrains the executive. And that was something they learned from the British, because it was the fact that taxation in Britain, long before Britain was anything like a democracy, taxation in Britain required parliamentary action. That meant that the Parliament had some control over the monarchs, even when the monarchs were claiming to be divinely appointed rulers with the right to do anything they liked. But they didn't think that that was enough. And so they gave the judicial branch strong powers, which very early on in the history of the Republic, the Supreme Court claimed the right to tell both branches that they were breaking the law. It claimed the right to say to the legislature, that law you just passed isn't consistent with the Constitution, so that law is not valid. But so that was all to do with the separation of powers between the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches of the government. But they realized that that wasn't by itself enough. And so they created a federal constitution, which meant that there were, in the first instance, 13 distinct states, which each had its own executive, judicial, and legislative branches. And those individual states retained powers which they could use in two important ways. One was to resist the claims of the central executive, the federal government, and the other was to do local experiments in government, which allowed individual states to try out different ways of living together in a community. The current powerful example of that is that what's called Obamacare in the United States, which is the current system for trying to make sure that everybody has access to health insurance, was nationalized by President Obama. That's why it's called Obamacare. But the experiment was first tried out in Massachusetts under a Republican governor, Mitt Romney, who campaigned to be a Republican president of the United States. And it was successful there. And that was part of what persuaded people in other parts of the country, those who were persuaded, to accept this new thing. So federalism has many advantages, I think, but one is this important one, that it creates 50 centers of power that can be used against the government when the government is overreaching. Now, that suggests a global model, right, in both of those two ways. It suggests that the existence of 190-something nations means that there are 190 centers of power that can use themselves against any particular centralizing power that's trying to take over everybody. And notice that today, where the United States is a very powerful actor, it's nevertheless constrained by the fact that a small state like Abu Dhabi, like the Emirates, United Emirates, has to be persuaded to allow American troops to act from its soil. That constrains what the United States can do. And if the Emirates has to be aware of the power of the United States, has to be careful not to make Mr. Trump angry, but it does have power against him. And that's very important because, as I say, the tendency of the executive at the center is to claim more and more power. And if we had a global Washington, there wouldn't be that possibility for the local states to say, no, we're not going to do that. But it also allows this other thing that I mentioned. It allows experiments. It allows what John Stuart Mill, the great British philosopher of the 19th century, called experiments of living. One of the reasons why many Americans are in favor of changing our healthcare system to one which involves the government more centrally, a so-called single payer system, a system where there's only one payer for healthcare, and that's the government, the central government, is because they've seen that that has worked pretty well in Norway or in Sweden or in France. And we wouldn't know that if everybody had to do things set by the rules in the center. And healthcare is one very important domain where states experiment. Costa Rica has done which has a very good healthcare system, by the way. Their healthcare outcomes are arguably better than the United States, has done the experiment of not having a standing army. They don't have a permanent army. That saves them a lot of money, and some of it they spend on healthcare. That's an interesting experiment. An experiment, by the way, which Immanuel Kant would have praised, because Kant thought that states who wanted to live in a world of peace shouldn't have standing armies. So I think there are very good reasons for not putting all the power in one place. It will be abused, and it discourages the kind of experimentation which allows people from different places to learn from one another. A sensible person who's made an argument against something should also concede that, of course, there would be things that went better if we had a single state. Tax evasion would be much harder if we had just one government. And tax evasion is one of the world's big problems today, because rich corporations and rich people are not paying their fair share. So would the management, I think, of drug cartels be easier, because drug cartels take over and influence local states in ways that allow them to use state power to protect them from law enforcement in other countries. So, of course, lots of things would be easier. But I think the biggest problem would be that if it went wrong, it'd be harder to do something about it. And it would probably eventually, in my view, very likely go wrong.
Yeah. So what you say is we need borders because it helps us to have a decentralized system with local small entities working together, or not? Is that the main reason why we need borders, to be more decentralized? So from a historical point of view, there were other reasons why people thought it would be nice to have borders, right?
But once you concede that you want nations and not one supernation, then you can think about what those nations have to be like in order to do the things that you want states to do, right? And one of the things, starting actually with a lot of German thinkers at the turn of the 1800s, that people argued, philosophers argued, in the lectures to the German nation, for example, was that nations needed to have some kind of sense of, they didn't put it this way, but let's use modern language, some sense of national identification. They needed, especially if they were going to be democratic, though this wasn't the early argument, they needed to have a language to speak to each other in, so that they could together as a people, as a folk, decide what to do. Democracies are states in which the people get to decide, and they get to decide by communicating with one another and sharing ideas and voting. But in order to do that, in order to care enough about the state to participate in that way, it was thought you needed also to have other things in common, not just a language, though that's a pretty substantial thing, but other cultural commonalities. You needed to have some kind of, well, what now is called a Leitkultur, some kind of basic set of cultural understandings that are shared by the people, by the folk that is going to govern itself in a democracy. We have learned in modern states that states can be quite diverse internally in many ways. I mean, Switzerland has 4 functioning national languages. South Africa has 11. Canada has 2. You can do, and Canada's about as democratic as you get. So you can be a democracy and speak more than one language. You can be a democracy and not all be Protestants or Catholics or Muslims or Jews. You can be a multi-religious state. You can be a democracy and have people who have very different ideas about how to live. You can be a democracy that contains people who think that homosexuality is wrong, and other people who think it's okay, and you can decide that the state will allow people to make those decisions for themselves. So you don't have to have the kind of strong shared national culture, but you do have to have, I think, a shared sense of identity. You have to say, we Americans have got to do something. We Germans have to do something. We British, or we English, or we Welsh, or we Scots, or we Irish, we have to do something together. And one of the most important things, just to go back to healthcare, which I may seem to be obsessed with, is that one of the most important things we do is we pass legislation in which my money gets spent to help the healthcare needs of people who have less money than me. We pay taxes, and those taxes go, since I'm a rich and successful person, I pay more into that system than I get out of it. Now, I am glad to do that because I am glad that when that money is being spent to help my fellow Americans. The people of New York State send more money to the federal government than the federal government sends to us. The people of Mississippi get more money from the central government than they send to the central government because they're poorer, they have worse roads, worse healthcare, worse education. Now, I wish that system was better. I wish Mississippi was doing better. But in the meanwhile, we're going to continue to subsidize them because they're our fellow Americans. It's harder to feel like that about money spent on just random poor people elsewhere in the world. I'm in favor of that too. But that has to come from a different motive. And the motive of care for your fellow citizens is another thing that, as I say, we've learned you can do that even if the citizenry is quite diverse. But you need that sense, I think, for a modern, democratic, broadly liberal state to work. Because otherwise, I'm going to ask the question, why am I paying all this money into the government and not getting back as much as I'm putting in? The perfectly good answer to that is because it's going to help Americans and I care about Americans. So now that's not directly responsive to your question, which was about, you asked the question was essentially about the virtue of subsidiarity, the virtue of letting decisions be made at the local level where they can be. I'm in favor of that too. I'm in favor of that because, partly for democratic reasons, the closer the decision is to the people affected by it, the more power those people have over what happens. And so, and the idea of democracy is that the people should have control over the way the state affects their lives. But also, it's just a practical thing. The reason that subsidiarity was invented by Catholic lawyers, Catholic canon lawyers, was because it was obvious that you didn't want to ask the Pope everything. If the parish priest can decide it, why on earth require the Pope to decide it? And so they said, if the parish priest can decide it, let him decide it. If the bishop can decide it, let the bishop decide it. If the cardinal can decide it, let the cardinal decide it. Don't take it to the Pope until the Pope needs to be brought in. So there are practical reasons why I think subsidiarity is a good idea, but there's also this democratic reason. So you asked, are there other reasons than that? But I want to start by saying that's a very good reason, it seems to me. But yes, there are other reasons. As I say, the main one is that you want counterbalancing centers of power to limit the desire of the executive always to seek power after power. That's a quote from Thomas Hobbes, by the way, who thought about these things. So that's a very important reason too. Also, if the states are to do these experiments, they have to have some control over who comes in and who comes out, because what it's going to cost to have universal healthcare for citizens, it depends on what kind of healthcare you give to non-citizens and how many non-citizens there are in your territory. And they used to say you can't have socialism in one country. And what they were thinking was that if you had terrifically good conditions for the workers in one country, the workers in other countries would all want to come in. And then you couldn't afford to have a generous system for your workers. Now, things are more complicated than that. Migration often increases the wealth of the countries into which the migrants come rather than reducing it. But that thought that you need to have some some demographic control, some control over who's in or who's out, I think that's a very sensible thought.
You mentioned that to form a nation, you need identity or some kind of shared identity. But isn't that so an illusion at the end? So as you mentioned before, we have states with, or countries that have really distinct states. Switzerland may be a good example, with really different cultures that connect just loosely. So what is identities? I mean, you wrote books about this. So what at the core is identities? Is it just a big lie? Is it just a misunderstanding? Or is it about living nearby? What is identity in the 21st century?
So I think there are three things central to all identities, including national identities. One is a set of rules about who's in and who's out. One is a sense among those who are in that it matters that they're in and that they care about being in, a sense of identification with their group. And the other is that people treat you differently depending on whether you're in or whether you're out. And those three things often exist, as you say, in a way that involves untruths, false beliefs. In the 19th century, a great French intellectual in an essay called Qu'est-ce qu'une nation said, nations are held together as much both by what they remember and by what they choose to forget. And that choosing to forget means that we tell stories about our countries that aren't strictly speaking true. For a long time in the United States, we told a story about liberty as the foundation of the Republic, while quietly ignoring the fact that many of the people who made the Declaration of Independence owned enslaved people, owned slaves, which is surely not a way of respecting liberty. And we kind of put that to one side. Putting that to one side was very costly because eventually we fought the bloodiest war of the 19th century, the Civil War in the United States, to put that right. So, yes, there's often elements of untruth in the stories that hold us together. That's why my book, The Lies That Bind, is called The Lies That Bind. It's because identities hold us together, whether they're true or not. Now, I think we should try and hope to be held together as much as possible by the truth. I'm in favor of truth against lies. But that doesn't mean that I can't recognize lies or, let's say, simplifications, idealizations are often part of the story that holds a nation together. So that puts you at something of a risk, because if people recognize it's a lie, that may reduce the sense of identification. But yes, there are lies built into identities, I think untruths, and that's a risk associated with them. But it's very important to recognize that holding people together is something that can be done by something that isn't true.
As a German, choosing to forget really resonates for me. So we have this country which once was divided. Now we have this reunification, and there's still this wall in our heads. It's really a current topic in Germany. So people are discussing there's still Eastern and Western Germany. We still feel the borders. It's in our heads. So any recommendations how we can forget our history from you?
I would be inclined to say that in that case, but maybe as a German you'll tell me this is silly. In that case, it's better to accept your history.
Okay.
It's better to say, yes, look, we lived for those generations separately, divided by one of the strongest borders in the history of the world, one of the hardest borders to cross. And and in that period, we had very different developments, political developments. Democracy wasn't super strong in the East. And on the other hand, the state provided a great deal more in the East than it did in the West, and people in the East got used to that. Also, the economy developed much faster in the West, and so the institutional structures of capital and wealth are much stronger in the regions that developed under capitalism than the ones that developed under the kind of state management that happened in the East. These are all facts, and they mean that it's different. Physical infrastructure and social infrastructure is different in different parts of Germany, in the East and the West. Now, look, the social infrastructure is different in North Rhine-Westphalia and Bavaria. You don't have to be in the East to have a different social infrastructure. Catholicism makes a difference to the social infrastructure. Being a state, a region of Germany with a strong history of distinct Protestant and Catholic cities makes a difference. But the sharpest divide, I agree, and why should I agree? It's obvious to you, and you're a German, is going to be between these two parts of the country that had these very distinct histories. But since the wall came down, you've been living together, and you're becoming more like each other, and also people can move from one side to the other and do the things that in a functioning capitalist system take the comparative advantage of one region to draw in resources that take advantage of that comparative advantage, and send resources and people out into other parts of the country where the comparative advantage is different. This makes the overall productivity of the whole system larger, and it allows you to have, if you choose, a strong welfare state that helps those people whose economic circumstances are affected by that long history of separation have better chances. You want to have equal education across the whole system. That's difficult if you've had very different political and economic histories, but it's something you can aim for. You can aim for it because we want Germans to be equal.
May I ask you a personal question? What's your identity?
Well, all of us have many identities, of course. I'm an American in terms of political identity. I've been a citizen since the 20th century. And
do you feel at home in the US?
Yes. It's very easy to feel at home in New York City.
Yes.
Because more than half the population is from somewhere else, whether they come from Minnesota or Mali.
So the definition of home would be to come from somewhere else, in a way.
Yes. I mean, it's consistent with that, to be someone who's come from somewhere else and is now identified with this city. This is one of the models, by the way, I think, of how we can think about our global identities, because I am a New Yorker. I voted for Mayor Mamdani. I'm proud to have voted for Mayor Mamdani. I think he's a good mayor. I voted for the governor of the state, and I voted for our two senators, and I voted for the local legislative representative who serves us in the Congress. When I'm voting for the city, I'm thinking mostly about New York issues, New York City issues. When I'm voting for the governor of the state, I'm thinking about the fact that we have a very large, powerful and important city in New York, but we have other cities, and we have a large rural area in the north and west of New York City, which has very different needs from the people of New York City. In the north of our state, in the Adirondack National Park, which is, by the way, the size of Wales, so it's huge, there are people who are farming and they have needs that are very different from the needs of those of us who live in this city. And I should care about that because I'm a New Yorker in the sense of a New York State citizen. But when I'm voting for the president, I'm having to think about many, many more things. And when we're thinking about our role as global citizens, we can take account of the fact that we are citizens of a city, a state or a region and a country, but also account of the fact that we live in a shared world which has shared problems of climate, problems of economic development, problems of pandemics, which we all have to face together.
Since when do we create borders, by the way? So in the early days of humanity, why did we start creating borders at all?
Yes, that's a very good question. I'm not much of an historian, but I mean, the early history of humanity, of course, is before cities, before towns, before urbanization. Hunter-gatherers, then in order to do agriculture, you have to settle in larger groups, and eventually you develop cities. So already by the 1st century, Rome has 1 million people. Beijing soon has 1 million people. These are large collections of people. And once you have, let's take Rome, once you have Rome, you need to feed it. And so the Romans developed large colonies in Africa where they grew wheat in order that everybody in Rome should have bread. They needed, therefore, to control those territories, not to have people wandering through them who could take the wheat that they'd grown and use it for their own bread. And so at that point, you need garrisons and so on to regulate who comes in and to regulate their behavior. So it's just inevitable, again, once you have resources to control, mines, fields of corn, cattle herds, once you have all those things, you need to, if you're going to be able to take advantage of them, you need to be able to stop other people using them, and then you need to stop people moving around uncontrolled. And so eventually you're going to need some kind of control of movement, and that's essentially what borders do. They stop people coming and taking resources that you have developed, and which it would be useless for you to develop if every time you develop them, somebody could come in and just take them away. So I would say the fundamental need is just to develop the kind of systems of property that are the basis for advanced civilizations.
While preparing, I stumbled upon this really, it's called the Robber's Cave experiment. I learned it from one of your books.
Yes.
You have to tell the story because it's all about how we create identity and how it changes, how we can change it after the fact. Maybe you should explain the experiment.
Yes. So this is an experiment that was done, I think, in the 1950s by a couple of famous social psychologists. They took two groups of boys, very socially homogeneous. I mean, they were all middle-class white Midwestern boys, and they settled them in two distinct camps in a state park for camping exercise. And then they got them to settle into a shared sense of identity. And then they told them about the existence of the other boys. And they brought them together to compete in sports and such. And very on in the course of this, I mean, in a few days, basically, they developed distinct group identities. One group, which won a baseball game after praying together, decided that they were the pious group. And the other group decided that they were the scrappy, unpious group, and so on. And they developed, in just over a few days, distinct sense of identity and distinct characters, and they gave themselves distinct names. That led to, eventually they had to separate them because they started raiding each other's camps and attacking each other. On the way back home, they did the experiment of having the bus break down in such a way that the boys had to help each other to push the bus. And once they faced a common problem, they were brought back together and they were able to do this thing in common, even though they had developed these very hostile identities. Now, it's an experiment, and social psychology experiments can be hard to reproduce, so not many people have tried to reproduce this effect there. They've used other experiments to produce identities very quickly. And it does look as though our brains, as it were, are programmed to generate group identities pretty easily, and for them to become the basis for hostility as well as solidarity pretty quickly. That is, they create solidarity within and hostility without. That's just part of how we are. But notice that the experiment is a neat experiment because it goes on to show that you can overcome the hostility by presenting a common problem.
What about global warming?
Well, so the reason global warming has, I mean, there are many reasons, no doubt, but one major reason why global warming hasn't created global solidarity, since it needs global solidarity and since the problems, nobody's going to escape the effects, is because there's a large and active body of people trying to distort the reality. And so they're allowing people who don't want to do some of the things we need to do to pretend that they have a reason not to do them, because anthropogenic global warming isn't happening. That is, they think that the climate may be changing, but it isn't changing because of anything humans have done. Now, the scientific evidence that it's connected with humans is overwhelming, but that doesn't mean there aren't people in the world who are busy trying to persuade people of that. The other thing, I think, though, is short-term thinking. Even some of the people who recognize the problem think, oh, but it's going to be costly. We're going to have to spend less on the things we enjoy and more on things we don't enjoy very much if we're going to solve this problem. And so let's put it off until we have to deal with it. Well, of course, the longer you put it off, the worse the problem is. But as I say, people are kind of short-termist. It's easier for them to focus on the costs in the present than on the costs and then on the benefits in the future, which is what the costs in the present will bring. So there are a bunch of things going on there. But look, those of us who do care about global warming do feel solidarity with the rest of humanity and do worry about the fact that there are island states that will be submerged as the polar caps melt, and that those people are owed by the rest of us not just concern about what happens to them, but activity in order to save them, to give them real prospects. So why do I think that? Because I'm in solidarity with these people with whom I share a common problem.
When you think about the current situation, for example, in Europe, also in the US, we have these borders, and people are trying to get into Europe, into the US, and we try to enforce these borders. Mm-hmm. What do you think about this situation? Tens of thousands of people rushing in. We are trying to deal with this. Yeah. How can we do that in an ethical way?
Okay, so there are ethical constraints on what you can do at a border. One is you have to take in, at least temporarily, people who have a reasonable case that they need asylum. When you let people in, you have to treat them properly. You have to treat them as equal human beings. You don't have to treat them as citizens, but you do have to treat them as equal human beings. You should allow people to cross the border because they're married to someone on your side of the border. People have a right to marry, laid out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the right to marry is meaningless if you can't live with your spouse. And I don't think that you should keep people out on the basis of race, because that's racist, and racism is wrong. My own preference is to live in a society where you don't keep people out on the basis of religion, but there are states like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia which are definitionally Muslim states, and they no doubt don't want people coming in who are Muslims or willing to convert to Islam. I don't want to live in a Muslim state because I don't want to live in a religious state. I don't want to live in a Christian state either. But there's at least a case for some kind of care about religion, because societies are entitled, I think, to shape their national cultures in ways that are reflective of their values. And so while I myself don't favor religious tests, and certainly it would be unconstitutional in the United States to have religious tests, I don't think that it's, as it were, totally impermissible morally. So there are constraints on what you can do, but you do have a right to keep people out. Now, however, given the urgency that is pushing these people around, some of which eventually is going to be, by the way, the result of our failure to do something about global warming, because some of those places in the hotter parts of the world are going to become places where agriculture is unsustainable if it gets too hot. Given the urgency of the needs, we have an obvious obligation to contribute to making the countries they come from places where you don't want to live. If people are willing to risk their lives and the lives of their children to cross a border, there's something wrong with the place they're coming from. And we ought to be concerned both for our own concerns, because we don't want to immorally deny people entry who are going to die if they don't come in, and because it's a decent part of our cosmopolitan obligation, our obligation as citizens of the world. We ought to be working very hard to try to understand what's wrong in the countries they're leaving, and to try to make those countries places that people don't want to leave, at least so much. So that's, in other words, it's not just a narrow question of border policy. It's a question of foreign policy, of global policy, of aid and trade policy to manage these borders. But I want to say, it's my view that if your border rules reflect the moral constraints that I mentioned earlier, then you are entitled to keep people out and entitled to tell them that's what you'll do.
Why is it so hard for me to feel solidarity? So I mean this in an abstract way, not me personally, but why is it so hard for us to have solidarity in some of these situations?
I think it's a fact of our psychologies again, that our sympathy, our empathy, our capacity for solidarity is much more easily evoked by a single case. You show people one child suffering, they'll want to do something about it. If you tell them there's 10,000 people at the border, that's abstract. They're not going to focus on, you can't focus on 10,000 people. And so it's harder for them to feel the kind of solidarity that they would feel if you presented them with a single suffering person. Our sentiments are not aligned with our moral obligations, I fear. This is actually a point that Adam Smith made a long time ago when he pointed out that if you knew that your little finger was going to be chopped off in the morning, you'd be more anxious about that than you would be about learning that 30,000 people had died in an earthquake in China. But what Adam Smith goes on to say is that doesn't mean that it isn't more important that 30,000 people died in China than that you're going to use your little finger, right? Our conscience should be attentive, not just to what we easily feel, but to what we ought to care about. I don't need to suffer the pain of taking on the death of 30,000 people in China, but I do need to want my government to provide the Chinese with aid if they need it when 30,000 people in China are killed in an earthquake and many others, of course, therefore wounded. So, we evolved as a creature before those cities that we talked about before. We evolved as a creature living in groups of 100 to 200 people. And we are exquisitely sensitive to the needs and concerns of the people we live with and in our families and our neighborhoods.
So what would be the perfect size of a nation, given the fact that we only can see 100 people?
Yes. Well, Aristotle thought the answer was about 10,000. Because he thought that was about the largest number where you could plausibly aim to learn something about the character of all the other citizens. Now, that's 10,000 men. They would have wives and slaves and so on as well. The disadvantages of being broken up into nations include the fact that it reduces the economic efficiencies that come from allowing people and goods to flow where comparative advantage takes them. If we were to divide the world into groups of 10,000, you would have the advantage that Aristotle saw, that we'd all know each other, but the disadvantage that if we had borders around those groups of 10,000, the world would be massively poorer. It would just be a huge economic cost. One of Africa's problems is that Africa has so many borders. If you want to send a shirt, you want to sell a shirt in Ghana and you live in Lagos, you've got to cross the border of Benin, then the border of Togo, then the border of Ghana. You've got to go through 3 lots of customs regulation, 3 lots of passport control, and that makes it very inefficient to drive shirts from Lagos to Accra. There are disadvantages of smallness as well as advantages of smallness. The interesting thing, to bring us back to identity, is that because identities do work, you can identify with many, many more people than you could conceivably come to know. Already, when there were 1 million Romans in the 1st century, they identified as Romans. They thought of themselves as Romans. Every day they were seeing Romans they'd never seen before, but they recognized them because of the way they dressed as other members of the populus Romanus, the Roman people. The advantages of solidarity, as you were implying, come more easily if you're a bit smaller. There are less than 2 million Namibians. They have a pretty strong sense of national solidarity, though they also have strong ethnic solidarities. The Herero have a distinct ethnic identity from the Ovambo people, for example. And the white Namibians have a distinct, the German-speaking white Namibians have a sense of identity as well. But as I say, Namibia has the disadvantage of being pretty small, and that creates economic disadvantages. So I'd say that history has delivered us two nations of over 1 billion people, and some nations like the United States in the hundreds of millions, and quite a lot of nations that are below 50 million. I don't think the ones that are over 1 billion are going to split up into smaller ones because they recognize, India and China recognize that being big gives their politicians huge advantages in the world. And they would be giving up some of those advantages if they were to split. But notice that India, British India, did decide to split. It's now 3 countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, because of a strong identity divide between Hindus and Muslims. So sometimes if there's a strong sense of identity within a group, within a nation, it might make sense for them at least to seek autonomy, regional autonomy, like the Catalans or the Basques or the Welsh, or the Scots or the Irish in Northern Ireland, or even to go their own way if they choose to. I think the Scots and the Welsh, I don't think the Welsh want to leave, but some of the Scots do, and some of the Catalans do. I think the Catalan people are entitled to make their own decision about that. They should obviously consult with the Spanish people because it makes a difference to Spain whether Catalonia is part of Spain. So I think you need to decide these things in the light of the historical contingencies of what it's possible to do in the way of creating a sense of national solidarity in the group.
I had the pleasure to talk to Francis Fukuyama 2 weeks ago for this podcast, who is famous for his book about the end of history. And there was a sense that at one point in time that nations would converge to the same kind of political identity. Obviously, that didn't happen. Why not?
The people who thought that probably thought it was a good idea because they had a model of a liberal democracy that they thought was the ideal state. I return to my point that one of the advantages of a system of nations is that people can do experiments. People can do experiments. There's no doubt in my mind that there isn't just one way to do democracy. There are many ways to do democracy. And they no doubt have different advantages and disadvantages. So I'd start with the thought that it's okay for people to try different advantages and disadvantages, to try different experiments of living. If they're going to do that, however, I think the international system has to place basic constraints on how they do it because the people have rights, human rights. And the one constraint that there should be on all the nations is that they respect the rights of the people within their borders and that they respect their international duties as set out in international morality and international law. And now, look, lots and lots of states in the world don't meet very, very basic conditions for being counted as respecting the human rights of their people, right? The United States abuses the human rights of its citizens in its prisons. Our prisons are among the worst in the advanced world, and it's a scandal. And more people in other countries should be telling us that it's a scandal and that we should do something about it. Our prisons are a disgrace. But they're not North Korean prisons, and we do have a kind of shambling democracy here. There's the possibility, unless Mr. Trump really does fix the next election, there's the possibility that we will change parties in charge of the House, maybe even the Senate, in November. So we're vaguely democratic at the moment. We're less democratic than we could be. And our system wasn't designed to be, in the modern sense, democratic because it has many deliberately anti-majoritarian features, like the Senate, which gives the typical voter in North Dakota 2 representatives, a tiny state with almost no people, and the typical voter in New Jersey, a large state with a huge population, 2 senators too. That's anti-majoritarian. It was meant to be that way. It was meant to be that way in order to strengthen the power of the smaller states. And that was part of creating centers of power independent of the federal government, and that's part of the constitutional design. But look, Ghana's pretty democratic. I grew up in Ghana. We've changed parties in power several times under the constitution that's currently in place. And I don't mean there isn't corruption. There's corruption in New Jersey elections. There's corruption in most countries. There's some small amount of corruption, and there's probably more in Ghana than there is even in New Jersey, which is probably one of the most corrupt states in the United States. But people do feel when they get a vote, okay, we're deciding who'll be in charge, and they are, because President Mahama, who's the current president, replaced a president of the other party. So, but do I think the conditions in Ghanaian prisons are acceptable? No. So Ghanaian prisons also, and again, international human rights organizations ought to be pressing Ghana, as they should be pressing the United States, to respect the human rights of people in Ghanaian prisons. So we need some kind of minimum conditions for a state counting as doing reasonably what a state is supposed to do, which is fundamentally and primarily to look after its own citizens. St. Thomas Aquinas said that a law is an ordinance of reason produced by those in authority to look after the people in their care. That seems to me a very good way of thinking about what laws are. So, yes, I think it's fine that there are different experiments going on. Norway has a different system of democracy from the United States. It has a different system of democracy from Sweden, right next door. But I don't think they should aim to copy each other, or that they should aim to copy the United States or anybody else. Please don't copy the United States. So I think we are in a situation where we need to push for the universal implementation of the rights of men and women everywhere. That means there are constraints on what governments can do. And because they are human rights, every human being and every government has a right to put pressure on every other government to respect them. So just to give one obvious example, there are, as you know, prime ministerial and presidential systems of democracy. They're different. They have different advantages and disadvantages. I don't think that we should all be aiming for one or the other.
Another reason why some people like me thought in the late 80s, early 90s, that there could be something like the end of political history was when the internet came around. And so we started communicating on a global scale. It was possible to talk to people in Australia. And I was wondering, why didn't we manage to have this cosmopolitan view at the end, which is also a very important topic for you? Why is it so hard for me to connect to Australians at the end?
Cosmopolitans, in my construction, are people who are interested in engaging with people who are not like that. And they're happy that we live in a world that is not homogeneous. The point of visiting Australia is because it isn't the United States. If I'm not going to go to Australia for surfing, because I can surf in New Jersey. Of course, the surfing in Australia is
much better.
good. So I might go for that reason. But there's very good surfing in parts of the United States, and there's very good surfing in places in Portugal, which is closer than Australia. One thing the internet has done is to make it easier to interact with people in other places without going there, which costs a lot of money, and rich people can do that. Most poor people can't afford to go to Australia whenever they want. And that has created new kinds of solidarity. There are people in small churches in the United States who are supporting people of the same faith in Tanzania, and they keep in touch by email and on Zoom and so on, and they have a sense of the lives in those other places. And that's part of what makes their engagement with those places not just an abstract sense of Christian duty, but a real part of their engagement with the world. I have a WhatsApp group that consists of a woman in Namibia, a woman in Lagos, and a woman in Eastbourne in England, because that's where my three sisters and we communicate every day. When my mother moved from England to Ghana, the way she communicated with her family was by writing a letter once a week to her mother, who wrote a letter back. So it's in a world of great mobility, one of the great advantages of the internet is that people who have other reasons for sticking together, like their relatives, can do so much more easily. My WhatsApp calls have a marginal cost of $0. So it doesn't cost me anything to discover that my brother-in-law in Namibia successfully went through a medical procedure this morning and is going back home this evening, which is something that I actually know. So I can't afford to go to all the funerals in Ghana that I should go to, because in Ghana you should go to the funerals of all the relatives of all your friends. But I can witness parts of the celebrations through the internet, and I can send money to pay for parts of the cost of running a funeral by just an online app that allows me to send $100 to somebody in Ghana. So it has made cross-national connections easier, but it hasn't made us all the same. We cosmopolitans weren't expecting it to make us all the same, because the reason we want to talk to people in Namibia and Nigeria and England is because they're not here. If they were, they're interesting precisely because they're not like us. And that's one reason why the very same impulse in cosmopolitans makes us want to know our neighbors who are different from us. Our neighbors are geographical neighbors. One of the joys of New York City is that you can get to know that I can go to bar mitzvahs, first communions of my friends. I can see the different religious traditions. I go to a Jewish Seder every year, even though I'm not Jewish. All of these things are possible because my neighbors are different from me in ways that are extremely interesting. So I agree that there's some sadness that in the years that the internet has developed, I would say on average, people in the North Atlantic have become less cosmopolitan, less willing to engage on terms of equality with people elsewhere, because they are more and more preoccupied with thinking that the economic problems of their societies are connected with migration or globalization, and that leads them to think that people in other places are their enemies. That's sad. I think that's a misunderstanding of what migration and globalization have done. But it is nevertheless the case that a lot of connections that wouldn't have been possible in the past are now possible. I'm going to give a lecture in North Dakota in September, but I'm going to give it from New York. And that allows me to learn about opinions in North Dakota, and North Dakotans to learn about the opinion of one New Yorker.
Mm-hmm. Is there anyone with whom conversation is impossible in this world of communication?
Yes, conversation is, as I like to say, an activity that involves a minimum of 2 consenting adults. You can't talk to people who don't want to talk to you. I don't want to talk to Nazis, so they're going to have a hard time conversing with me. But if a Nazi is a fellow citizen of mine, I'm willing to pay the cost of talking to him or her in order to see if I can persuade them that they ought not to be advocating the policies that they are for our country. As far as politics goes, I believe you should be willing to talk to anybody who's willing to talk to you, even if their views are repugnant to you. But as I say, you can't talk to people who won't talk to you, and that's the one barrier that you cannot overcome. I declare myself open to conversation with anybody. For political reasons, there are people it's more important for me to talk to than others because they're either because they're persuadable or because their views are so dangerous that I want to understand them so that I can contain them. But I'm willing to talk to anybody. In this respect, I realize I am unlike a lot of people. You see, a lot of people I know think you just shouldn't talk to certain people, shouldn't talk to racists, shouldn't talk to homophobes. I think that's wrong.
But that's the extreme. There has been some kind of reinvention of identity maybe in the last 20 years. And I have the feeling that this also led to a disruption in communication in some ways. So do you see that tendency, and how should we overcome this? Or is it just important to have these, to come back to our topic, is it important to have these borders and to have well-defined identities?
I think that sharply defined identities tend to cause problems. I would say wear your identities lightly. You can't abandon them. Human beings don't work without identities, but you can recognize that you have many identities. You can stop one identity triumphing over your other identities. So you decide, okay, I'm a Lutheran, so I won't talk to any Catholics, ignoring the fact that some of the Catholics that you might talk to are also interested in Greek history, which you're interested in, and you would have a good conversation with them if you were willing to talk to them about Greek history. So we should wear our identities lightly. We should recognize we have diverse identities. And yes, it is a problem that people won't talk to each other. I write this column for the New York Times. From time to time, I get letters from people saying they don't want to go to a family gathering because their uncle is a supporter of Donald Trump and he says abhorrent things at the dinner table. Well, it's sad when a family is broken up by political divisions of that sort, in my view. And also, it's bad for politics because, horrible as it may be to listen to your Trumpy uncle, if nobody who disagrees with him ever listens to him, there's no chance of getting him to see that what he thinks is mistaken, and no chance of you coming to understand why he holds the views that he does. You can't dissuade someone of something if you have no idea why they think it. So my general tendency is to urge people just to keep trying. I was very lucky when I was a teenager because when my grandmother, whom I lived with when I was in England, got older, like many older people, she moved into a house, into a smaller house, but it happened to be a smaller house next door to the bigger house. And so the person who moved into the bigger house became our neighbor. And he was, I think it's reasonable to say, one of the most right-wing members of the English Parliament. I was not conservative. My family weren't conservatives. Everybody in my family that I knew of either supported the Labour Party or pretended to. My great-grandfather was the first Labour leader of the House of Lords. My family's been Labour since the beginning. But I got to know him, and he taught me how to fish for trout in a local stream. He drove me across England to Cambridge, where he had been to university in the 1930s, and introduced me to the college that became my college. The college I went to as an undergraduate, the college I was a graduate student at, the college I was a fellow of, and the college I am now an honorary fellow of 50 years later. He did those things. He took me to my first livery company dinner in London, the first, which is one of London's interesting cultural institutions. It's also the first place I tasted Gevrey Chambertin. I remember tasting this wine, and my family didn't drink much, and I'd never tasted a wine so delicious, so I remember it 55 years later. So I got to know that someone could have terrible politics and be a very nice person. That's been very important for me my whole life. I spent the trip back from Cambridge, several hours driving from Cambridge to Gloucestershire. I spent the whole time trying to persuade him not to vote for the reintroduction of capital punishment, which was coming up for vote next week. At the end of the trip, he said, "You won all the arguments, Anthony, but I'm going to vote for the reintroduction of capital punishment." And he did. Fortunately, more people had the correct view, so he didn't win. So I obviously he wasn't racist, unlike many right-wing English people. Otherwise, he wouldn't have hung out with me. But he was in other ways very right-wing, and he supported other members of Parliament who were racist, and he knew they were. So what I'm saying is, I was improved by this because I understood better why someone might have been in favor of capital punishment, and I hope he was improved, not because he changed his mind, but because he heard, as clearly articulated as I could articulate them as a teenager, what the arguments were on the other side. So in terms of citizenship, I think one of our sort of obligations as citizens is to talk to anyone who's willing to talk to us in good faith. There's no point in talking to people who are just wasting your time and not interested in the arguments, because you're not going to learn much from them and they're not going to learn much from you. To the extent that people are willing to talk to you, I think you should be willing to talk to them. And as you say, more and more people who support trans rights won't talk to people who don't support trans rights. More and more people who support gay rights won't talk to people who are homophobic. More and more people who are anti-racist won't talk to people who they think are racist, and so on. And I don't think that's good. It should be said, of course, that one of the social sanctions for holding unpalatable views is criticism and eventually ostracism. And so I'm suggesting that we ramp up the criticism and ramp down the ostracism. That's my proposal. Given the way people think about identity in my country today, nobody's going to take any notice of my proposal. They're going to go on shunning each other, and I believe that's part of the reason why our politics is such a mess.
If you had to predict maybe that's a strange question, the future of borders. So will we have more borders? What will they look like in the future, in the far future, let's say in 50 years? What's your feeling?
Well, if the world goes the way I would like, there are going to be two important pressures. One is climate change. And as I said, parts of the world that used to be productively habitable are going to become uninhabitable. And parts of the world that used to be habitable with great difficulty are going to become more habitable. Russia, the Russian steppes are going to become better and better places to grow wheat. And Africa's tropical belt is going to become a harder and harder place to grow food for human beings. So that's one pressure which will want people to move. But there will be a pressure in the other direction if things go the way I hope, which is the generalized development of the whole planet will mean that the reasons for leaving other places will diminish. More places will be democratic, so people won't have political reasons to leave. More places will have middle and upper income economies, so there'll be fewer economic reasons to leave. More places will respect human rights, and so there'll be fewer human rights reasons to leave. And so the pressures on borders should diminish. Also, I think it's going to become increasingly clear to people what the logic of comparative advantage means. The population of Europe is aging. The healthcare in Europe has improved. Medicine has improved. People are going to live longer. There's going to be more need for people, young people, to look after old people. If your population is increasing in age, then you need to look to the places where the average age is young in order to recruit the nurses and the doctors whom you're going to need. It's already the case that if you took the migrants out of the British healthcare system, it would collapse. My Ghanaian niece is a nurse in England. If she and everybody like her left, I mean, she's a British citizen now, but so she wouldn't have to leave. But if people like her stopped coming, or if you kicked out the ones that were already there, which is maybe what Nigel Farage would like to do, then the healthcare system would collapse. So there are reasons for thinking that it's in the interest of those young people to come and get good jobs. It's in the interest of the old people to have people look after them, people rather than robots. So I think there's a comparative advantage reason for trying to persuade people that there's reason to allow lots of movement, though until there's rough parity in social welfare provision around the world, there will be a pressure for people to move from places with worse provision to places with better provision, because that's a significant part of what determines your life chances in the modern world, is access to decent healthcare, unemployment insurance, and so on, and job opportunities. So my hope is that there'll be borders, there'll be distinct states with distinct societies trying out different experiments, different kinds of democracy, different kinds of balance between private and public healthcare and so on, all of which are things reasonable societies can disagree about, I think. But less reason for people to move except for the pleasure of seeing what it's like in another place. There's plenty of reasons for tourism. And so I hope that borders will be less anxious places. And also, given the technology, it'll be, I know that you Europeans are currently making a great mess of managing your borders because you've introduced technology that wasn't ready. But once that technology is perfected, it should be very easy for people to cross borders because all you'll need to do is to scan their faces and let them in, which is what happens to me as an American citizen when I enter the United Kingdom.
One last question. Do we need borders?
Certainly now.
And in the future?
I don't know. I'm a philosopher, and I don't know what. I couldn't have predicted what the world would be like 5 years ago today. So 50 years, that's way beyond any reasonable guesswork. But as long as the world remains as I would like it to remain, a world in which different societies are trying out different experiments, power is not concentrated in just one place, but is distributed both within states and across states. As long as the world remains like that, you'll need borders to manage the movement of people across them because nations require membership.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for those excellent questions.